Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining in today's seminar entitled Gastrointestinal Hormones Impact on Fat Loss and Hypertrophy. So for the purpose of today's seminar, I will be running through the slides, giving you a little bit of information pertaining to the different bullet points and how they can actually interrelate and correlate with one another towards optimizing our integrative state towards our body composition goals that we may have as well. At the end of the presentation, if anybody has any questions, we'll do a little Q&A section at that point. So up until that point, if I can ask you just to please keep your audios on silent for the time being. And when we get to the end, we will go through a couple of questions as well. So with that being said, just to get started over here. Okay, guys, so first and foremost, what exactly is hypertrophy? So hypertrophy, especially for those that are working within the fitness field or have been trainers or just iron warriors, immediately think muscle and the growth of muscle. But in truth and fact, hypertrophy is the enlargement of any cellular size. In particular, when we talk about hypertrophy of muscle tissue, we're talking about the size of myocytes. Okay, there are two types of training stimuli that we can think about when we are considering hypertrophy. And these type of training stimuli have a different impact on the nervous system, which is so important to consider when we take into account the state of our stress and our autonomic tone. So the two major types of training stimuli that we have are entitled myofibril as well as sarcoplasmic. So myofibril is in essence a type of hypertrophy where we have a greater load with a longer time of eccentric lengthening of the muscle tone itself. And in doing so, it initiates the release of specific growth factors by activating satellite cells. As an example would be insulin like growth factor 1. In contrast, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is, in essence, when we increase the volume and the load of hydrogen ion metabolism due to increased concentration of lactate accumulation of higher volumes of repetition. What this does, in essence, is it shifts the mitochondrial DNA sequencing of 5 different pathways called oxidative phosphorylation pathways. And this, in turn, what this does as well, it shifts mRNA sequence adaptation to mTOR pathways that increase the quantity of sarcoplasm within a muscle cell itself. So, in essence, the difference between the two types of hypertrophies, myofibril has a more of immediate impact on androgen production, whereas sarcoplasmic will have a greater impact on facilitating G-coupled protein receptors, which will increase the release of growth hormone, hormone-sensitive lipase, and in turn, this will also have a positive impact on leptin sensitivity if kept within measurable checks and balances and quantity. When we have an excessive quantity of lactate accumulation or an excess quantity of training in general, what we might find is that these specific sequences of proteins that are activated can actually facilitate unwanted inflammation throughout our physiology, such as increase of cytokines and in specific situations, chemokines as well. There are two major players. There are major players within hypertrophy. Insulin is probably the most anabolic hormone known to our body with the most immediate impact. It is not a cholesterol-based hormone. It's more of a peptide-based hormone, meaning that its action is far more short-lived, but far more dramatic in its shift and change of physiology. We have our androgens as well, such as testosterone, IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, which is an outcome from the precursor of growth hormone to the production of also peptide-based hormone that facilitates localized growth factors and release, as well as thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone also plays a huge role in regulating the growth sequence of muscle tissue. Fat loss. All right, so this is where most of us, and especially when we're over the age of 30, really want to start concentrating our efforts toward how we can better improve the way our abdominals look, the way in which we are able to fit in our clothing, and just generally the way in which we feel about our bodies. So fat loss is through the activation of beta oxidation pathways. In essence, acyl coenzyme A is converted into pyruvate from different glyceride molecules, and through the utilization of lipids, it will actually utilize, if utilized properly, will help to sustain an optimal state of autonomic nervous system stability. So the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is the balance between how stressed we are and how well we are able to rest and digest as well. So in order to improve how we're able to activate specific fatty acids for energy, we really also need to consider how we're able to improve our lactate threshold. So although when we look at different forms of training, the forms of training that have a greater tendency for prolonged activity at a lower respiratory stress rate will actually induce a greater utilization of fat. However, exercises that have more of a high intensity variable will increase the activity of mitochondrial DNA, which will improve oxidative phosphorylation pathways. So in essence, what we need to do is do a combination of cardiovascular-based training, first and foremost to improve on how the mitochondria work, and second to improve the system that the mitochondria uses in order to facilitate energy metabolism itself. Major players to fat loss, glucocorticoids such as cortisol, plays a huge role in the facilitated release of glucose for the system. Norepinephrine, which is one of the catecholamines, also plays a huge role in fat loss by activating other lipases, as well as improving the circulatory rate of our aerobic systems, as well as our cardiovascular systems. Growth hormone and activating G-coupled protein receptors, through the activation of G-coupled protein receptors, also increases the facilitation of lipases, and then thyroid hormone as well, increasing the total thermogenesis and metabolic rates themselves too. Just for those who have joined, please just make sure to mute your calls just whilst I'm doing the initial part of the presentation. As we get to certain slides, I'll open up the floor for any conversation over Q&A that you guys may have. Right, so those are the basics behind hypertrophy and fat loss in a very rudimentary sense. So now what we're going to be doing is getting ourselves into a little bit more detail behind the digestive processes and nutrient assimilation. So a little acronym I came up with about 2 years ago called DADU. It's entitled Digestion, Assimilation, Detoxification, and Utilization. In essence, these four main elements play a huge role in our health of our entire physiology, and we're going to get into each of them into a little bit more detail as we go through the slides. The three major symptoms of poor gut health when these four elements are in disarray would be hyperchlorhydia, which is another word for meaning poor stomach acid release as well as regulation. Dysbiosis, the imbalance of flora within the gut, or in certain cases, pathogenic flora proliferation in the gut, issuing diseases such as diabetes, all the way through to the potential of even cancer cell growth too. Endotoxin accumulation from poor activity of final phase liver detoxification, as well as bile activity and integration of specific rates of modification and conjugation in the liver, which entitled our phase 1 and phase 2 activity of the liver. So a couple of the main organs that we obviously need to consider when we talking about the gastrointestinal tract would be the stomach. So within the stomach, we have parietal cells, which are responsible for the production and the release of hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is an extremely acidic variable that is required in order to activate certain sequences of enzymes to facilitate protein digestion, as well as to initiate specific variables of pH in chyme, which is when the food is created into a bolus through stomach acid rotation to allow the nervous system to recognize that acidity of the chyme and create a subsequent reaction from the pancreas to release alkaline variables in the intestinal tract. So it's very, very important to understand the stomach is a space of high acidity, low pH, whereas the small intestine is an environment of high pH and low acidity and greater alkalinity. So into that as well, we also have chief cells, or also contained in the stomach. Chief cells are responsible for the release of pepsinogen, which is activated into pepsin when our pH is under 3.5 due to the facilitated release of hydrochloric acid. One of the major players in regulating parietal cell activity is the hormone gastrin. And gastrin plays a huge role within the parasympathetic nervous system through vagus nerve activation. And when we find ourselves to be highly stressed, we can have premature and excessive release of gastrin, which can actually cause gastric lining or mucosal cell destruction within the stomach itself, leading to things such as peptic ulcers. Another contributing factor to this is actually the bacteria H. pylori, which causes dissociation within our autonomic nervous system, leading to impaired gastrin release and subsequently imbalanced acidity and the release of hydrochloric acid as and when it should not be released. Going on to the small intestine, we have our pancreas, which is responsible for the release of a multitude of alkalining factors. Most notably, it's also responsible for the release of bicarbonate as well as enzymes that help to break down our protein, fats, and carbohydrates. It also has an impacted role through release of another hormone called CCK, or cholecystokinin, and it is needed in the release of bile through the facilitation of contractions to the gallbladder itself. It helps to maintain the integrity of the mucosal border through its release of bicarbonate as and when acidic chyme enters through the biosphincter into the small intestinal tract. And then moving on to the large intestine, it is a main state and position of hydration that we need to have within our gastrointestinal tract. Once again, anybody joining into the call, if you guys can just mute the call, mute your speakers for the time being. And when we get to the Q&A section, I'll open up the panel for discussion. Just going back to the large intestine, it is the place for hydration to occur through the gastrointestinal tract. Vitamin B1, B2, and B12 are highly absorbed through the large intestine. B12 is also mainly absorbed through the stomach, as well as zinc absorbed through the stomach, as well as iron is shifted and altered in the structure for better absorption through acidity in the stomach. So the large intestine plays a huge role in the regulation of the stomach, hence the reason why I'm bringing it up in conversation now. It also regulates afferent and efferent nerve sequencing from the enteric nervous system to the central nervous system in the release of specific other hormones, such as motilin or somatostatin. And these particular hormones play a huge role in the motility rate of our gut. So as and when we have poor initial reaction of acidity in the upper tract of the gastrointestinal sectors, we might find that our large intestine is unable to properly utilize electrolytes, properly balance out all the trace elements that our body needs, and actually subsequently create dehydration. Now, a lot of people, when they come toward integrative medicine, and we ask them about their hydration habits, they all state that they're drinking 3 liters of water and above. Yet, often what we'll note on specific blood panels is an impaired albumin to globulin fraction, which is one of the indicative factors how we can see what's going on within the hydration of one's body. Just very, very important to note is not only water that one needs to consider to require hydration. Actually, quite importantly, it is the balance of all 84 trace elements that the body needs in order to facilitate intracellular hydration because of the role that these particular trace elements play with protein transamination and as well as utilization. To that extent, glutamine, as many of you would know, is also utilized widely for the repair of the intestinal tract and tight junctions. However, when glutamine is utilized in the wrong circumstance with poor hydration occurring in the large intestine, it can actually create excessive hydration to the intestinal tract, causing more inflammation and further increasing reactivity of monocytes to create more inflammation and more intestinal impermeability or more intestinal permeability. So we really need to consider the state of the large intestine and the state of how well it is able to maintain hydration when we're looking toward our overall hydration state as from a physiological standpoint, perspective and point of view. And as is widely known, the body is majorly made up of water. So when our states of hydration are impaired, conductivity within the nervous system also becomes disorientated, leading to stress, leading to poor proprioception, and a lack of an ability to be able to train to our most optimal state as well. Hypochlorhydia, okay, so the hypo meaning a deficiency or a lack of chlorhydia, chloric acid, so it's a lack of hydrochloric acid released through the stomach. Often is due to poor parietal cell function that can occur over time due to poor feedback loop of a stress response, which we'll get into a little bit later. Poor conversion of pepsinogen into pepsin occurs, which is required for protein digestion to take place. When we do not have sufficient protein digestion taking place, we will find an excessive quantity of urea that circulates around our systems, creating damage to the kidneys, and also creating damage increasing the likelihood of dysbiosis and the flourishment of unwanted pathogenic bacteria. The environment of pH above 3.5 in the stomach depicts possibility of hyperchlorhydia. It's particularly once a person has had food. Diet, stress, and all of these impact the possibility of hyperchlorhydia as well. When we do note a state of hyperchlorhydia or stomach acid regulation, zinc and B12 absorption is highly impaired. And the reason as to why B12 is highly impaired will require sufficient quantity of hydrochloric acid in order for the release of another substance called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is a major player in the absorption as well as the utilization of B12 and subsequently its correlative utilization with folate as well. Is heightened through poor thiamine and zinc levels. So vitamin B1, very big player in the management and the regulation, or should we say modulation of hydrochloric acid. Interestingly, thiamine is also a major player in oxidative phosphorylation pathways. So when we do note a deficiency of thiamine, what you will normally see is a impaired glucose control. This doesn't necessarily mean that fasting glucose levels or HbA1c levels might be dysregulated, but what we need to look at in specific scenarios that might have indication of poor thiamine quantity are markers such as the estimated average glucose. This will give us a good indication of how well the body is reacting to food. In addition to that, also to look into C-peptide levels and fasting insulin levels, which give us a very good indication of the HOMA indexes, not just of the total HOMA index itself, but also beta cell and also cellular receptor sensitivity to the hormone insulin too. Okay, the three organs of major importance, should we say accessory organs to the processes of digestion, assimilation, detoxification, utilization would be that of the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. So liver is really important for red blood cell metabolism, which is a necessary factor to produce energy, as well as aiding processes of trans and deamination of amino acids. Okay, so transamination is a shift in the transfer of amino acids from one state to another for the processes of everything from hormone production all the way through to neurotransmitter production, and even in specific scenarios, enzyme formation. Deamination is obviously the shift of amino acids to more of an energetic process, creating carboxyl attachments of the amino acid group to be available for the production of more energy. The liver is also responsible for detoxification. It is one of the major sites for detoxification in the body, and we're going to get a little bit into the different stages of detoxification as we get into this presentation a little bit later. It's also responsible for bile formation, whereas the gallbladder is responsible for bile storage. The majority of our bile is actually formed in the liver through the metabolism of red blood cells. The pancreas, we have our exocrine and endocrine compartments of the pancreas. Exocrine compartment, it consists of digestive enzymes and bicarbonate. And as I mentioned to you before, both are necessary in not only the utilization and assimilation of nutrients that we consume through food, but also to facilitate the environment of alkalinity so that those enzymes can actually be active in the way in which they need to be activated. The endocrine compartment of the pancreas is very interesting. So we get beta, alpha, and delta cells within the endocrine department. So our beta cells are responsible for production of insulin. Alpha cells are responsible for the release of glucagon, and our delta cells are responsible for the release of somatostatin. And it's very much so impacted by the state of our circadian rhythm, which is actually impacted by a part of the brain, a small region of the brain just below this basal ganglia called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It actually forms part of the basal ganglia as well. And this part of the brain helps to regulate wake and sleep cycles, but it's also very important in regulating our stress, as well as our ability to be able to manage different brainwave activities and states. So interestingly enough, those of you who know about the different names to brainwave activity, you'll notice that the cells that make up the endocrine system are actually very similarly named to those of the endocrine compartment of the pancreas as well. And for due and causative effect. So with insulin, obviously an increase of insulin is a heightened response to blood sugar in the body, which facilitates the quantity of mitochondrial activity. Also facilitates a greater, also facilitates a greater turnaround of thermogenesis if there is a sufficient sensitivity to the hormone insulin. Whereas alpha glucagon helps to mediate the release of glucose rather than the uptake of glucose, which also, in essence, when we think about alpha brainwave activity, actually puts you more into that motivated but calm state of thought processing. And our delta state, although we don't, our delta 1, 2, and 3, somatostatin is actually quite closely linked to a sympathetic drive in that it helps to slow down gastrointestinal motility, preserving energy for the nervous system for other functions. So very closely aligned to brainwave activity, the endocrine compartment of the pancreas, beta, alpha, and delta. Obviously, we don't have gamma indicated here, but that is a topic for its own conversation. The next organ that we're going to discuss here is the gallbladder. The gallbladder is responsible for the release of bile, so too is the liver, but to a greater extent that of the gallbladder. And bile is required for fat emulsification, but it's also required for detoxification, the third and final phase of detoxification. So conjugated toxins that have been altered in their chemical structure that are conjugated for the process of elimination go through the process of elimination by being bound to bile, which obviously gets eliminated through fecal and urinary matter through the body itself. So in essence, when we have an insufficiency of bile, our liver ends up going through a process of what they call intrahepatic recirculation of toxins. In other words, the bile isn't adequate enough to basically take those toxins that have been conjugated and being eliminated. So it goes back into the intestinal tract, which goes back into the bloodstream, back into the liver. And liver really is compounded with a lot of stress and a hell of a lot of loss of energy, which impacts the health of our mitochondria in the long run as well. So hypoglycemia, reactive hypoglycemia, basically this is the outcome of when we have energy dips, when we get shaky. This is like a precursor to the development of diabetes. So those of you who are actively looking into your fasting glucose levels in the morning, be careful to note that if your fasting glucose levels are consistently lower than 4 millimole per liter, it is an indication that you might be actually suffering from reactive hyperglycemia, which is actually an outcome of poor parietal cell activity or the likelihood of either pathogenic pathogenic insult or infection, as well as impaired autonomic tone within the parasympathetic compartment of the nervous system itself. What are the causes that can lead to all of this? Consumption of, when we say too many carbohydrates, understand carbohydrates are not our enemies. Actually, quite on the contrary, carbohydrates have a huge amount of antioxidants, fiber for our gastrointestinal tract to operate in an efficient manner. But what we're referring to here, as you can see in the picture, are refined carbohydrates that lack nutrient density that natural foods would actually contain in order to assist the body in the metabolism of the energy source of carbohydrate itself. Also habits. It's very, very important to note that, we become habitual in our need of stress. And through that need of stress, we also become habitual in our immediate modulation of stress through the intake of sugar. So those of you who've worked in the corporate sector or are under immense amounts of pressure, you may find yourself having a lack of appetite certain times of the day, just driving yourself into working hard behind a computer, having a lot of exposure to artificial lights and a lot of exposure to extreme amounts of information to process. And you go through a few hours, and then all of a sudden, you start to become anxious, start to become stressed. And the first thing a lot of people do is turn to either a can of soda or some form of sugary condiment or food in order to modulate that impact. And the reason as to why this happens is insulin is inversely related to cortisol. In other words, when one is high, the other one cannot be high. Thus, when we do crave sugars, it's often due to the fact that we're not modulating our stress in an efficient manner. This is also another reason as to why specific dietary protocols can have their benefit, but they can also have their detriment if applied in the wrong circumstance. Now, what I'm referring to here is intermittent fasting or fasting protocols. I use them quite extensively. They are a fantastic tool to help rid the body of excessive unwanted microbiome due to the fact that unwanted microbiome have a shorter half-life than that of wanted microbiome. However, in states of chronic stress response or poor hypothalamus adrenal axis activity, when we do put ourselves through these type of dietary protocols, we're only exacerbating the likelihood of our cravings and the likelihood of us actually putting further detriment onto our adrenals and overall metabolism. So another point you mentioned over here, too much insulin is released, causing glucose levels to drop, and side effects here, shakiness, headache, irritability, confusion, insomnia, cravings, and more glucose, okay? So the excessive amounts of glucose also have a negative impact on release of specific hormones that dampen our sexual endocrine system. Another consideration to take into fact when we are considering how we're eating our food, not just the food that we eat, but how exactly are we going about our day to maintain an optimal state of stress as well. So big management issues here, okay? So when the liver isn't able to store enough glucose, and this is often due to fatty liver buildup for a multitude of reasons. Toxins can be one big reason if you're living in an area in the world where there are a lot of petrochemicals, a lot of additives, a lot of artificial stimulus like non-native electromagnetic frequencies. These all have an impact on the state and the health of the liver. If the liver is in a state of excessive fat accumulation, it isn't able to store as much glycogen as it should. And this causes a stress response to the brain, creates a reactivity to note that there isn't enough glycogen, which causes liberation of stress-inducing hormones. So the state and health of the liver is vitally important to take into consideration when we are experiencing reactive hyperglycemia, and often by doing a successful liver cleanse by utilization, depending on the severity of the liver dysfunction. One of my favorites is actually utilizing ozone treatments with glutathione as well as NAD, obviously not on the same day, but utilizing them all as aids toward improving the state and the health of the liver, as well as all our other methylation factors and sulfation factors, which should be coming predominantly through the diet when the body is in a healthy state on its own. Markers to consider with liver function: AST, aspartate transferase, alanine transferase, ALT, lactose dehydrogenase. So these three markers are very, very important. When we find ourselves to have a impaired quantity of lactose dehydrogenase, it also is an indication there again that our mitochondria are under severe amounts of stress. All right. So in terms of our glycolysis pathways, when we have a poor quantity of LDH being performed, it is actually an indication of poor innate NAD formation, as lactate is actually readily converted into NAD through this enzyme. So a deficiency of this enzyme really has a negative role and impact on the health of our mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells to produce energy. And the state of our mitochondria, not being excessively active or not being underactive, is very important to take into account toward maintaining cellular integrity, as well as avoiding excessive loss of electrons or oxidation. Just going back to liver again, AST and ALT. AST, aspartate, almost acts as what's an amino acid that acts as a salt and in creating a catalytic reaction of energy production, whereas alanine transfers ammonia from the periphery back to the liver for the conversion of acetyl coenzyme A, which is a precursor to energy production. So it's very important that when we look into the function of our livers, that we're not just considering the single variable values of each of these markers, but rather the correlative values and the ratios that they share amongst one another. Because the ratios can really tell us as to how well the liver, which is not only an organ for detoxification, but it is very much an organ for energy manufacturing, as well. So we can see exactly how well the liver is able to manufacture energy, or the amino acid transaminases the process of amino acids for energy, but as to how well it's also able to utilize the metabolites from that energy production to further warrant more energy sustainability. So really, when you're looking into the state of your liver, look at AST, ALT ratios, and also look at the overall quantity of LDH, which supports both of those sequences and activities in the liver, as well as its role it plays in mitochondrial health. Adrenal function, calcium, potassium should be over 4.5, sodium under 135, depleted chloride levels. So as soon as potassium is over this amount, as soon as sodium is under this amount, and as soon as we have depleted chloride levels, then we know we're in a state of adrenal stress, okay, or adrenal insufficiency. So really look out for these variables, guys. Potassium levels over 4.5, sodium levels under 135, and overall depleted chloride levels. Really look into possibly ordering, if you are a functional medicine practitioner or a fitness coach, a saliva hormone test, which gives you more of an accurate depiction of the diurnal rhythm of cortisol rather than just the quantity. It also gives you indication of the free variables of the hormone rather than total quantity and serum values of the hormone itself. Renal function also plays a huge role in reactive hyperglycemia. Blood urea nitrogen levels can go up when we have poor hydrochloric acid regulation due to poor protein digestion and the utilization of amino acids. Creatinine levels can also increase dramatically when there's poor protein utilization throughout the body. Creatinine levels can also increase, obviously, in a high protein diet. So it always needs to be taken into consideration and into context of the person that we're dealing with. But nonetheless, every nutritional plan should never necessarily be maintained as a consistent factor unless the health is maintained in a state of consistency. Then, of course, maintaining that dietary plan or nutritional plan would be wise to do. However, when we do note imbalances that occur in one's physiology, really looking into incorporating a difference or a shift in dietary implementation would be beneficial toward not only the state of our goals, such as building muscle or burning fat, but also to the state of our organs, which enable us to do so. So before I continue, I'm going to open up the floor here just for a little bit of a break. Obviously, it's a lot of information to digest. Does anybody, you may all unmute your speakers now. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Any questions there, guys? You like to ask a question there, Lizette? You have to unmute your. If anybody wishes to ask a question,
no,
please have to unmute.
I don't want to ask a question. I'm just showing you everything is good.
Okay, fantastic. Good to hear. Good. All right. All right, guys. If nobody has any questions to ask, I will continue on with the presentation. Okay, So the next section over here is blood sugar and hormones influence on body composition. Okay, so low levels of blood sugar can potentiate the release of hormone-sensitive lipase, which is a fat-burning enzyme released through a metabolic shift. Okay, now note, however, when we say low levels, we're not talking hypoglycemic levels. We're talking in levels between a 4.2 and 4.8 millimole per liter fasted state. So when we're able to shift our bodies into this position of glucose in the fast state in the morning, we've noted a high amount of fat loss, actually threefold greater than those who actually maintain a fasted glucose state above 5.2 millimole per liter. And this is noted through our stats that we've been able to produce for autonomic coaching over the last 4 years, as well as other coaches in the industry sharing very similar stats as well. So the optimal state or position, the sweet spot, if you want to call it that enables fat loss to potentiate its greatest capacity is maintaining a glucose position of between 4.2 and 4.8 millimole per liter in a morning fasted state. The second point of that is an increased level of blood sugar can stimulate the release of insulin and promote recovery. Let's remember, insulin is actually a vital hormone that plays a huge role in mTOR pathways. And mTOR pathways are specific mRNA sequence pathways that enable muscle growth and increase of hypertrophy to occur. Now, with insulin sensitivity, our bodies are better able to potentiate not only the drive of needed amino acids for RNA sequencing for muscle growth to occur, but it also improves the rate in how we utilize glucose into the formation of glycogen, which is a massive storage energy format that actually enables better intracellular hydration and communication with different organelles within the cell itself, including the mitochondria. So insulin is not a bad hormone, it's not an evil hormone. No hormones are evil or bad. It's always about how we utilize them, whether or not they can be detrimental or they can be beneficial to our physiology. Sustained low glucose increases stress perception and ghrelin output. So ghrelin is a hunger-based hormone. It does activate G-coupled protein receptors. However, when we sustain the release of ghrelin for a long period of time, our bodies become desensitized to this particular hormone. And as I noted before, in certain situations, such as when we are working for long hours behind a project at work, as eyes glued to an artificial stimulus like blue light of a computer screen, what we might find is that we actually lose our appetite and we just keep on driving. And this is an actual depiction of poor ghrelin sensitivity. So this has a negative impact on adrenal activity and can actually impact the chronic stress response in the hypothalamus adrenal axis, which we will discuss in brief in a moment as well. Sustained high glucose reduces leptin sensitivity and endocrine regulation. So when we impair our sensitivity to leptin, we also impair the utilization of and the release of insulin and the quantitative release of insulin. When we have an excessive abundance of insulin circulating within our physiology, other hormones are also activated, such as aromatase. Sex hormone binding globulin levels increase, and this all has a negative impact onto our other hormones that are needed to potentiate hypertrophy or fat loss, namely those of androgens, as well as thyroid-based hormones too. So all of this can actually facilitate the outcome of diabetes and other forms of metabolic syndrome, such as thyroiditis, such as Addison's, or low levels of blood sugar may reduce high-density lipoproteins. Okay, so when we are in a constant state of dietary or caloric deficiency, we might find that we actually reduce the quantity of our HDL fractions. And this is not due to the fact of a lack of intake of healthy fats. We must remember that cholesterol is almost a reactant to oxidative stress in the body. So when we are sustaining a high amount of caloric output or vigorous training or exercise stimuli such as hypertrophy, which induces breakdown of myofibril compartments, what we might note there is that our shift in the utilization of cholesterol from that of producing hormones to that of actually repairing microabrasions to the arterial tracts, it shifts towards a greater quantity of LDL. So make sure that when we do have low levels of blood sugar, obviously we're talking extremely low levels here, sustained throughout the day. Yes, it does help with fat burning. Yes, it does help with your health to a certain extent in facilitating facilitating an increase of insulin sensitivity. But however, the impact that it may have on oxidative stress throughout the periphery can also be duly noted. So this also has negative impact on reducing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone release, as the high density lipoprotein component of our cholesterol profile is predominantly used for the formation of androgens. And just to touch on this previous point as well, recently we had a patient of ours about 6 months ago that came in with amenorrhea. For those of you who don't know what that word means, it means a loss of menses or menstrual cycle. And one of the biggest contributing factors to this particular patient having an inability to be able to regulate her menstrual cycle was due to the fact that there was a high amount of caloric output, a low amount of caloric input for a prolonged period of time for purposes of fitness shows and modeling and so on and so forth. Subsequently, we improved her metabolic intolerance, got her to be able to sustain a higher caloric intake, and through that sustenance of a higher caloric intake, her menstrual cycle returned to an optimal state without excessive pain, without excessive bleeding, and also the quality and the color of the menses was not that of a dark, deep red, so indicating there that it was not an excessive loss of iron either. So there are a lot of considerations that one needs to make when we are going to be implementing dietary plans of a lower caloric nature. We really need to consider the length of time and the impact that it is having as to our blood regulating or blood sugar regulating hormones as well, and the subsequent impact that that might be having on our sex hormones too. High levels of blood sugar may excite the nervous system and set imbalance to the autonomic nervous system. And this really plays a huge role in dopamine and the impact that high amounts of sugar actually facilitate in the production and the release of dopamine. Now, dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter for motivation, for drive. It's very important for the limbic system in the development of motor patterns. However, once again, as noted before with the previous statement toward hormones, there aren't any bad neurotransmitters, there are not any evil hormones. But however, it's the quantity in their use and release that can either create a detriment or a benefit to the body. And this cannot be more dramatically emphasized to that and the utilization of dopamine as to how well it is metabolized. Okay, insulin and blood sugar. Okay, so it's the most anabolic hormones released from the beta cells of the pancreas, as mentioned before. It activates mitochondrial function and thyroid activity. ATP production, however, greatest source for fuel of ATP to cause oxidant release. So high levels of insulin can actually increase the loss of electrons. Spikes at the right time during periods of controlled catabolism. In other words, the quantity of training a person does or the quantity of stress a person exposes themselves to is vitally important to consider. Often when, as being a human, like a fellow human like the rest of you, we go through our periods of ups and our periods of downs. And often when I go through my slumps, I start to read or watch videos, and I get a little bit frustrated in some of them where it talks about the 5 a.m. club, it talks about consistency. And although these are very important psychological factors to take into account, what it is actually missing is the fact that on a cellular nature, it may not be a lack of effort or a lack of will, but rather a lack of ability. And this can be really cited in when we impair the regulation of our spikes of insulin, as well as regulation of our exposure to stress. So stress is a good thing. However, adaptation to stress is even more important to consider. So for those of you who are going to be committing or investing your time and effort and money into a training program to build muscle, to burn fat, really consider exactly how much you can tolerate. Often, more than not, what I've seen of my previous years, 6 years ago when I was a trainer and a therapist, is that people would generally run into a training program full, wholehearted, guns blazing, trying to get what they needed to out of it, i.e. fat loss or building muscle, only to feel within 4 to 6 weeks completely fatigued, annihilated, or to have lost the lack of interest, or for other factors of their lives to become compromised, such as cognition or the ability to be able to work effectively within their fields of respective employment. So it's very, very important that when we do embark upon any type of training regime or any type of dietary regime, that it is done with due care of constant monitoring. This is the reason as to why with autonomic coaching we utilize biometrics on a daily basis to measure exactly when stress has been modulated out of its optimal state and rather into a state of negative return of investment. Excess insulin will promote fat cell enlargement and cardiovascular strain, also increase the density of fat accumulation in the liver. This is due to the increase of blood sugar and triglyceride concentration. So not to go into too much physiology behind this, however, when there is an excessive quantity of glucose within the bloodstream, it gets converted into triglycerides from the liver. It's effective to promote recovery and boost fat loss if regulated with receptor sensitivity and synergistic hormonal relation. So it's very important when we look at insulin, when we look at diabetes or metabolic syndromes and all the diseases that are associated with metabolic syndrome, that we also look into other hormonal pathways that might be impacted. I think this is also where there's a shortfall in the current medical paradigm, is that when generally people come in with a symptom or a host of symptoms, it is labeled as a disease. And within a disease, it's a very fine line or very narrow corridor that people associate other aspects of physiology to that disease. However, when you look into a person's physiology from a more global perspective, lateral perspective, we don't just look at the state of dysfunction, but we look at other systems that could be contributing to a state of dysfunction, we might find the remedy in places otherwise not have thought about. And this can be really seen when it comes to diabetes in the regulation of androgens as well as cortisol, and as well as the pregnenolone steal that occurs with the excessive production of cortisol or the insufficiency in the release of cortisol that can be modulated as well by improving sleep quantity, quality, as well as other lifestyle factors, as well as other peptide factors that actually can help the immune system to better support the diurnal rhythm of cortisol itself. It's destructive to the endothelial cells if the sensitivity to insulin is reduced, thus limiting glucose disposal from the bloodstream. Okay, this is also very important within the gastrointestinal tract. So it really does create havoc and harm when there is poor permeability. The reason for this is that there is reactivity of pathogens that can enter the bloodstream and create a further increased stress response, which would be mitigated by insulin too. So it's very important that when we're looking toward improving insulin sensitivity, obviously exercise is one of the most immediate ways to do that, as it enhances GLUT4 dependent transport activity, which is a transport aid to the utilization of insulin. But we also need to look at other GLUT transport agents as well, GLUT1, GLUT10, GLUT2, and even GLUT10 activity as well, because when we find that specific GLUT transport activity is outside of its regulation, it may not necessarily be due to the dietary measures that we implement or do not implement into our lifestyle, but rather foreign entities that might be creating an infection into our bodies, facilitating an unwanted immune reactivity to heightened rates of inflammation as well. So in these specific cases, doing a stool test to ascertain what is actually going on within the gastrointestinal tract is of the greatest amount of importance, because often when we do not eliminate specific parasites or bacteria from our bodies, particularly bacteria that are very stubborn to get rid of, such as H. pylori, what we might find is we just end up fighting a losing battle, and that all our efforts just don't create the right regulation of the gastrointestinal endocrine component of function within our efforts of fat loss itself. Just to touch on that as well, I'm all for natural remedies, and the functional medicine paradigm is very much a platform to promote natural remedies as a solution. However, when it comes to integrated medicine, it is incorporating the use of all functional medicine paradigms as well as conventional means of medicine. Now, when it comes to particular insults that are occurring within the gut, it's always about the density of that insult. To a certain extent, yes, the majority of parasites, majority of bacteria can be eliminated through natural means. However, one really needs to look at the symptoms, the other associated systems, as well as the density of the infection to warrant whether or not natural or allopathic means may be necessary. And when we utilize allopathic means, there's no harm nor foul in doing so. However, it needs to be approached with the responsibility and understanding the depletion factors that allopathy might cause the body when implementing its use. So medication is absolutely okay to incorporate within specific circumstances. However, very, very important to take a look at firstly contraindications and also the factors of stress that it creates into the body as one of the biggest reasons as to why we're using the medications to get rid of a stressor that could be impacting our gastrointestinal endocrine system. Catecholamines and cortisol. Okay, before I go on, I'm just going to do a little bit of a Charles Poliquin moment here. For those of you that were around during his time, we're just going to ask 10 things that you guys have learned. So I'm just going to go through the group and ask one person at a time. Just one thing that you've learned so far in the presentation itself. Dr. Nishwitz, if I don't mind, you ask you to unmute. If you can just give us one thing that, or one or two things that you found interesting that you learned during this presentation. Okay, Dr. Nishwitz might be in surgery here. If we move on to Marinus and Sunfake. Marinus, if I just ask you to unmute and just to give us one or two things that you've learned through the presentation thus far. All right, Marinus, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Now we can hear you.
One interesting thing that I learned much earlier was when you were talking about liver toxicity and glycogen. For me, that was interesting.
Okay, thank you, Marinus. Thank you. Just ask you to mute your speaker again there. The next person is, I don't know who this person is, but it's a K, letter K. I'll ask you to unmute your speaker there. Okay, sure. Okay, move on to the next person here, Christian Lynch. One or two things that you found interesting. Okay, I think Christian is also probably at work. A lot of people were listening at work today. Moving on to the next one, Ansu van Eck.
Hi,
hello.
Jasmine, can you hear me?
Hi, Ansu. Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, one thing that I've learned here is that stress has got a very big impact on all your functions in your life, on all your liver, your all kinds of things.
Most certainly. I think people underrate exactly as to what quantity and severity stress has an impact on the state of one's liver, let alone the gastrointestinal tract as a whole, but particularly on the liver, the impact that it can actually have on increasing the density of fatty liver buildup, which is extremely devastating to the state of one's nervous system, in particular the brain. As the brain accesses most of its glucose through glycogen stored in the liver itself. So when there's an impaired capacity of the liver to store glycogen, it really can have detrimental impacts to the brain later in earlier and later in life, but particularly as life goes on, the likelihood of forming particles such as beta amyloid increases as well. So yes, 100% right in that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
And if you just mute your there, gonna just over here. I think there's a doctor on board here. Ask her to unmute. Hello. Okay. Right. And okay. And then last one here, Lizette. Anything to add?
Hello, hello. Sorry. Yes, I think I want to also go with Ansu's observation about the stress, and not stress itself, but continued, high levels of stress, because I think you've mentioned that we all need stress to function. But yeah, the high level and the wide impact it has on all our bodily systems. So that is what I really take away from the session so far.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Right, I think the rest of everybody will just continue with the questions in the next break. Just to continue on with the presentation now again, catecholamines and cortisol. Catecholamines coming from the medulla of the adrenal gland, cortisol coming from the zona fascicularis of the adrenal gland. So they're both released from the adrenal glands, and their regulatory release comes from the pituitary, the anterior component of the pituitary to be precise. Excuse me. So with regards to catecholamines and cortisol, the adrenals influence on blood sugar management. So the brain cannot store glycogen, unlike other compartments of the body. So when the brain is low in its availability of energy, it will facilitate the anterior pituitary to release precursor hormones to the adrenal glands to actually facilitate the release of glucose into the bloodstream. And this is the reason as to why stress modulation should take precedence, not only through that of biochemical modulation, either allopathy or naturopathy, but also through lifestyle interventions such as psychotherapy, diaphragmatic breathing, even going into doing infrared light therapy and photobiomodulation. Very, very important, because a lot of our stress doesn't necessarily come from imbalance of chemistry, but also imbalance of practice, lifestyle practice itself, and the perception of how we need to facilitate getting tasks done or accomplishing things that we have set for ourselves in the future. So with catecholamines and cortisol, the adrenal influence of blood sugar management, the medulla is a direct impact on the central nervous system, okay, and then we have the cortex. So this is basically the output of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Very interesting is that our dopamine metabolism actually produces norepinephrine. So when we have sufficient balance between the central and the peripheral nervous system, we will find that we will have sufficient quantity of hormones and elements to improve on circulatory impacts of our entire bodies as well, reducing the likelihood of neuropathy, reducing the likelihood of edema, reducing the likelihood of hyperlipidemia as well, the impact that it would have on the arterial systems of the body, improving the rates and how we are able to modulate cholesterol utilization throughout the body, i.e. reducing less of the low-density lipoproteins, which are utilized to help repair microabrasions in the arterial tract. The next part of the adrenals and the cortex, there are three major zones that impact the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the zona fasciculata, as I mentioned before, glucocorticoids or otherwise cortisol, that's contained in the middle component of the adrenal gland. The zona glomerulosa is where the aldosterone or mineralocorticoids are released. This helps to regulate osmotic balance in the body. And the zona reticularis, where androgens such as DHEA as well as testosterone is produced in smaller quantities. Testosterone and DHEA is also produced from the reticularis. Predominantly is the site where DHEA is produced. Very interesting to note as well, for women that are suffering with excessive hair growth or excessive hair loss on the top of the scalp, it's very interesting to look into DHEA levels, as this can be a facilitator for the unwanted growth of hair and the unwanted balding of hair in specific areas of the female's physiology. The reason as to why DHEA levels would increase is actually because the body's trying to keep up with the impacts of stress. So DHEA is what they call a neuroandrogen. So in essence, as neuroandrogen, it protects the brain from the excessive release and quantity of cortisol that might be flooding the system. The activity of glucocorticoids may increase the release of hormone-sensitive lipase, depending on metabolic flexibility. So very important as to how well our bodies are able to utilize fats or carbohydrates in the state of rest. Often when our autonomic nervous system is imbalanced and we're utilizing more carbohydrates as a fuel source in the state of rest, we have a greater quantity of electron loss, which is otherwise known as oxidation. And this oxidation can really impact our sensitivity to other glucose-regulating hormones, but particularly impact the brain as well, and how the brain regulates. And how the brain regulates glucose utilization in its own right. Increased activity within the adrenals adds stress to the kidneys, impacting the health of all three accessory organs to digestion. So very, very important when we think about digestion to really think about this HP axis over here, the hypothalamus pituitary axis. Looking over here are the potential sources of stress: anger, fear, worry, anxiety, depression, guilt, overwork, not getting enough sleep, physical and mental strain for those that are complete gym addicts, excessive exercise, sleep deprivation, light cycle disruption, so not getting enough darkness within your bedroom when you go to sleep, late hours. For every hour that one stays awake past 10 o'clock, the increase of cortisol, the impact that cortisol has, the increase that impact of cortisol has on the x-axis is up to 30% greater. So it's quite a huge amount that it actually increases by over a period of time. So it's very important to make sure that you're getting enough darkness in your bedroom, and you're also not having any electronic devices that could further disrupt this light cycle. Also, another thing that helps the light cycle is to get natural blue light when you wake up rather than artificial blue light, as this helps pineal's regulation and the release of, pineal's regulation and communication with the basal ganglia, which actually should be coined basal nuclei, given where they're contained in the nervous system, but helps the basal ganglia to release more effective dopamine quantity. So it's very important that when you do wake up, to try and get some natural light before you start your day in the office, if you're going to be under an environment of artificial light for periods of time. Surgery, trauma, injury, whiplash, head injury, inflammation, pain, temperature extremes, toxic exposure. Recently, we've had the pleasure to have a family member, client, come on board, Dr. Nishvitz, who is the world's probably most aforementioned biological dentist, and he can tell you a hell of a lot in his book, which I'll also be posting up on the Instagram thread once this video goes live, on the impact that toxins can actually have to bacteria, saliva exposure, as well as to the impact that it can actually have on pH variables, and subsequently the impact that pH variables can have on reactivity in the nervous system itself, or impaired reactivity to the nervous system itself. Infections, chemical, heavy metals, once again, going back to not only exposure from the environment, but also exposure from modern day medical interventions, such as emulsion fillings. Electromagnetic fields, particularly non-native electromagnetic fields, radiation, geophysical locations. So if you're flying around the world, you're being exposed to a lot of radiation, first you've being up a few thousand kilometers up in the air. And then in addition to that, you're going into different climates with different microbiome. and different stressors, this is also going to be a big impact on the potential source of stress and how it impacts your hypothalamus pituitary axis. Going into malabsorption, again, could it be because of bacterial insult? Could it be because of poor stress balance and modulation? Maldigestion, are you chewing your food for long enough? Are you producing enough saliva? Subsequently, are you also producing enough reactivity within the autonomic nervous system to facilitate gastrin release? Or are you waffling your food down without giving the nervous system time to facilitate the release of hormones to break the food down effectively? Illness, low blood sugar due to poor diets, or starvation diets, or low-calorie diets. Nutritional deficiencies, allergies, foods, mold, and pollens. Nutritional deficiencies, I just want to put in there, don't just come about from, often people say, oh, I take lots of vitamins, I take lots of nutrients, I take lots of supplements. It's not necessarily about what you take, it's about how your body is able to utilize it. You can take a lot. It's like having a car fill its tank with petrol, but the combustion of the engine doesn't work. It's going to overflow, yet there's going to be no energy produced from the engine itself. So it's really not about nutritional deficiencies. It's not necessarily about the intake, but rather about the utilization of micronutrients that you need to be taken into severe consideration as well. Mold, pollens, which are all, we become more susceptible to their impact when the state of our liver is predominantly impaired. So particularly mold. And obviously this has an impact on our immunity, and the subsequent impact on our immunity further has, again, onto our thymus and our spleen as well. So very important to just take a look into the health of the liver, take a look into the health of the thymus, take a look into the health of your circulatory systems as well as detoxification systems, i.e. the kidneys as well, and the lymphatic systems too. All of these have an impact on the sympathetic system, the stressful system of our autonomic system, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, creating an impact on the hypothalamus pituitary axis, which impacts the adrenal cortex, which basically depletes total DHEAS, depletes free quantity of DHEAS, and the ratio between cortisol and DHEA can really give you a good indicator whether or not a person is entering into states of adrenal fatigue or hypothalamus pituitary stress response is not regulated in its best possible outcome. What you might find there is a total increase in cortisol and also a total increase in free cortisol. This is the initial reaction. Over time, the body becomes fatigued. And what you'll note is even a worse scenario where you don't have sufficient quantity of cortisol, which means that you enter into the realms of autoimmune disease, means that you enter the realms of fibromyalgia, means you enter the realms of chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, complete apathy within life itself. Cortisol is a very, very important hormone to modulate the activity of mood, and particularly how it plays a role in the oxidation of tryptophan and playing a subsequent role with insulin sensitivity too. So when we don't have enough cortisol, I would go as far as saying it's worse so than we have an excessive quantity of cortisol, as in trying to repair the immune system with insufficient quantity of cortisol is quite a tall feat to do. So if we can catch the fire, or if we can nip it in the bud, it will really prevent us from a lot of immunological strain that can come about from poor cortisol profiles in the future. Just going into that, so energy production, insulin sensitivity decreases with high cortisol levels, glucose utilization becomes impaired, so the brain becomes more likely to have brain fog. Blood sugar increases, which increases inflammatory outcomes such as the proliferation of prostaglandin 2's outcomes, as well as cytokines. Gluconeogenesis also increases as well, which is quite interesting because obviously most would know that gluconeogenesis is the outcome of low blood sugar and the facilitated release and conversion of fats and proteins into glucose. However, when there is an impaired cortisol response, the glucose that is currently available in the bloodstream isn't sufficient enough to create an antagonistic reaction to the liberation of energy. So what the body will do is start to break down its protein stores first and foremost before its fat stores, very unlikely to break down its fat stores in this state, to actually further increase the glucose concentration to facilitate a poor cortisol profile in the body itself. Other influences, osteoporosis. Cortisol is a big modulator for the utilization of calcium and phosphorus, As we know, calcium is a big player in the initiated release or initiated sequencing of nerves and motor neurons and as such. So when we have poor regulation of cortisol, poor utilization of calcium, irregular activity of the parathyroid gland subsequently will come about from that over time as well. And this can really create a reduced density of bone mass and increase the quantity of osteoporosis. Fat accumulation around the waist for the protective measures to protect the organs. When the body is in a state of stress, it's going to do whatever it can to protect the most vital elements of life, which are those of the organs. Protein breakdown will increase, as mentioned before, for the process of gluconeogenesis that was talked on a moment ago, as well as cortisol being a liberator of, or mediator, of proteolysis too. One way in which to help prevent this is actually the utilization of leucine in specific circumstances, not in all circumstances. Leucine can actually also be a negative amino acid to utilize specifically when there is already hypoglycemic impacts occurring within one's physiology. Other factors here are salt and water retention. As mentioned before, calcium is obviously a facilitator for the nervous system, but so is sodium pump channels, also mediate activity of neuron cells. So when we have an excessive activity of the sympathetic drive, mentioned before, and the potential sources of stress, this will really influence as to how we utilize calcium and how we actually utilize sodium within our nervous system. Immune activity, serum IgA levels will decrease, and this will make the bowels more susceptible to pathogenic insults. Antigen penetration will increase as well. Circulating IgG levels will increase. Natural killer cell activity will also decrease. Interleukin-2 activity will decrease, and T lymphocyte activity will also start to decrease. And this is the negative impact that it will have on our state of immunity, instigating the likelihood of autoimmune reactions in the future, as well as potential proliferation of oncogenesis, or in other words, or layman's terms, the increase of cancer cell growth. Clinical conditions to consider that could be contributing toward this chronic stress response. Chronic viral infections, Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, herpes 1, 2, and as such, HIV is another one. Increased infection, yeast overgrowth, allergies, fatigue, headache, autoimmune disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, insomnia, hypoglycemia, hunger, PMS, premenstrual syndrome, depression, irritable bowel, digestive problems, ADHD. So these are all clinical conditions that have labels in conventional medicine, which is what people are labeled with, either insomnia or having ADHD or having fatigue, chronic fatigue. But they're actually the outcome. They're the symptoms to the outcome of the systems that are irregular or dysregulated due to potential causative factors. And this is where I really truly feel very strongly and passionately about the fact that modern day medicine really needs to shift the way in which it looks into disease. Rather than just looking into the label of it, try to understand better the root cause. It's generally, we've come into a condition now in society where it's a pill for an ill. And this format is not sustainable, firstly, not to our physiology, not to the medical systems and the health of society as a whole, and also not to the productivity of the species. Actually reduces our productivity by a severe extent. So in order for us to become more productive as human beings, and also to become more empathetic and considerate of our fellow man, we really need to take out the drive of sympathetic dominance in society and within ourselves. Not by just labeling a disease, but by better understanding its root cause and problematic factors that could be proliferating those root causes as well. Energy release and systems. So glycolysis, basically glucose is converted into pyruvate, to acyl-coenzyme A, which is formed into adenosine triphosphate. Hydrogen ions are the limiting factor in glycolysis. So this is really your high intensity interval training, your interval training as such, maybe not necessarily HIIT, that's more of the phosphate systems, but partly goes into the glycolytic systems of oxygen independent components of those systems. Used during dramatic shift in energy needs. So basically from fight or flight responses, your initial system that you would use is the glycolytic systems. which is not a system that we want to be using on an ongoing basis, for the fact that it is very heavy in reducing the raw material available in our body, and very light in contrast, reducing energy. Where in contrast, when we look at like the electron transport chain, it produces far more ATP without at the cost of far less raw material in our body. So when we're in a state of rest, we really don't want to be in a glycolytic dominant state, but rather more in the state of a lipolytic state of energy utilization, just for the fact of energy efficiency and mitochondrial efficiency throughout our entire systems as well. The Krebs cycle over here, mitochondrial function of acetylcoenzyme A from either pyruvate or oxaloacetate, which goes through processes of transamination to occur. Beta oxidation, ketone activity, mitochondrial biogenesis, and this is what I mentioned to you guys before as well, is making sure that the mitochondria become better programmed, if you want to call it that, toward utilizing fats or ketones as a predominant fuel source in states of rest, as opposed to that of glucose, which is a far greater energetic depth and stress impact to what we mentioned in the previous slide, to the sympathetic drives of stress outcomes. Appetite regulating hormones. Okay, so this is very, very important when we're looking to embark upon any type of nutritional plan, but also very, very important when we're embarking upon balancing out depression or any type of psychiatric imbalances. Often people neglect to remember the impact that appetite regulating hormones have on serotonin, dopamine, GABA, gamma-aminobutyric, and glutamate responses in the brain. In particular, the correlation that they have to acetylcholine. So the balance between leptin and ghrelin plays a huge role in the use of choline in the central and peripheral nervous system. And acetylcholine is vitally important to regulate the cardiac rhythm or the sinus rhythm of our cardiovascular systems, as well as increasing the drive or the potential drive of motor neuron activity. So acetylcholine increases the way in how hard we can actually contract our skeletal muscle tissue. However, it reduces the sympathetic drive of cardiac muscle tissue. So there's a reason why, with regards to leptin and ghrelin, managing both of them into balance is extremely important, so that we don't, sorry, one second. Sorry guys, has anybody got their audio on? Could I just ask you to put it off? There we go. Sorry, one moment. So just with regards to leptin, it is the hormone of satiety. In other words, it allows you to know when you're full. For those that are leptin insensitive or desensitized to leptin, before you go ahead and have more food on your plate, so say that you're following a nutritional protocol that's been designed by a professional, and you have the quantity of your fill, you still feel hungry, just give it 10 minutes before you go ahead and dish up more food on your plate. Often what can happen with poor leptin sensitivity, the feedback loop from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system can be delayed. So it's very important that if you're looking to increase leptin sensitivity, just give it a good 10 minutes after you've had a plate of food before you go and consume more calories. Increases cognitive function, increases the synthesis of PD-1 cells. Okay, these are dopamine cells, which are the type of, so D1 cell activity increases sympathetic drive in the brain. In other words, it makes you more alert, more awake, makes the hippocampus more reactive toward information retention and acquirement. Increases activity of neurons containing alpha-melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is very important for vitamin D utilization, and the impact it subsequently has not only on calcium use in the bone density, but also nervous system, as well as activity it has on lymphocyte quantity, and also reactivity the lymphocytes may have on an infection. Interleukin 6 increases testosterone. So there's slight interleukin 6 in dramatic quantities can be really negative to inflammatory rates, particularly in autoimmune conditions. But the right quantity of interleukin 6, it creates reactivity to the induction of production of testosterone. So, once again, it's not about something being good or bad for you, but it's rather about the quantity and the duration of its release that can be detrimental or beneficial to one's health. Leptin resistance has a correlation to saccharide indices. Okay, so in other words, you have a greater quantity of glucose circulating in the system due to the fact that leptin plays a role in insulin activity. So with poorer leptin sensitivity, so too will come poor beta cell regulatory output of insulin. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have high blood sugar or poor HbA1c levels with leptin resistance, but what it will mean is that you may have poor quantitative release of insulin from the beta cells during peri-meal intake, peri meaning before, during, and after a meal intake. Leptin sensitivity is linked to the dopamine regulation, as mentioned before, with the PD-1 cell too. The ghrelin is a hunger hormone. Lets us know when we need to eat. It facilitates G-coupled protein receptors, increases release of fat-burning hormone. It's important in learning and development, increases gray brain matter. Okay, and gray brain matter is a lot slower than white brain matter, as it doesn't contain myelin, but that's a lot where the processes of feedback inhibition occurs within our brain and brain matter. So when we can improve the density of brain matter, we will also find that cognitive processes also increase. Increases the output of dopamine. Now this is D2, the activity of D2. So leptin increases the synthesis of PD-1 cells. So D1 receptors, okay, basically help to facilitate the activity of dopamine. D2 receptors actually put the brakes on the activity itself. Sorry, it's the other way around. D1 brakes and D2 facilitates activity of dopamine in the cell. So when dopamine is released into the brain, there are certain sequences that will have an uptake, and there's other sequences that have a feed forward or feedback inhibition occurred due to that uptake of dopamine. So what leptin does, it helps to maintain the quality of your brakes as to how well your brain uses dopamine. And what ghrelin does, it helps you improve the quantity of acceleration that you can actually have release in dopamine itself. So both are vitally important as brakes and acceleration in terms of the dopamine activity in your brain. It's important for learning and development. Optimal ghrelin output reduces anxiety and increases testosterone. Optimal. Once again, when going for faster periods, for prolonged periods of time, ghrelin will be increased by quite a dramatic manner, which will reduce sensitivity over time and will increase anxiety and reduce testosterone. So once again, it's about the time period and also about the particular case of which we are addressing. So this, not to say that fasting is bad for anybody, not to say that ketogenic diets are bad for anyone, but implemented in the wrong circumstance, they definitely can be. Suboptimal output of ghrelin reduces sleep and increases depression due to imbalance noted between the dopamine and serotonin it may create. Okay, so we really need to consider exactly how much ghrelin we are releasing. An example of this, during my time of having helped a lot of bodybuilders, fitness models, and even some athletes that had to cut weight before fights and before events, they would go through periods of extreme volumes of training. And in those extreme volumes of training, they would have very little calories, but very high amount of nutrient intake. But even with the high amount of nutrient intake, the ghrelin quantity reached the point where they would actually reduce, the ability to achieve deep wave sleep. So it's very important that we look into factors of our stressors in life. As mentioned before, exercise is one stressor, but there are a multitude of others. And as to what the stressors are actually doing to the impact of our appetite regulating hormones. So, caveat to what I mentioned before, if you do not have an appetite, it is not necessarily a good thing. One should have an appetite, but one should not have an excessive appetite. One should not also have the dramatic need or the reliance on sugar. So if you're craving sugar, you're craving refined foods, this is also a likely outcome due to poor modulation of your hypothalamus pituitary axis. Just to go into some neurotransmitters, basics of neurotransmitters. Dopamine is excitatory to the brain, reduces choline release in neurons. Okay, so choline is very, very important. As I mentioned to you before, it helps to keep things balanced in the brain and the peripheral nervous system, dopamine increases the heart rate via the method of it actually reducing acetylcholine quantity activity within the central nervous system and subsequently the peripheral nervous system and the cardiovascular ventricles as well. Regulates learning and development, neuromodulator of all neurotransmitters. Okay, so dopamine really helps to balance out the activity of acetylcholine, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and serotonin, and very, very importantly, glutamate as well. All right, so glutamate is the most abundant of all neurotransmitters. I haven't gone into too much detail here on glutamate because it is a tall topic to discuss, and we're just touching on a bit of the basics here. Catecholamine created dopamine dominance. Okay, so when you have an excessive quantitative release of stress, as mentioned before for factors, you will increase the quantitative release of dopamine. This can initially be beneficial, but detrimental in the long term. Dopamine increases the release of cortisol, glutamate response, increases the mesolimbic reward pathway. So this is why it's really important for movement pattern learning, but again, in the quantity required. And exercise facilitates neural degeneration. So the same neurotransmitter that can help you to move better or to learn how to lift heavier weights or learn how to retain information about medicine can also create neural degeneration to those exact pathways that you facilitated new stimuli through. Acetylcholine, responsible for excitation of skeletal muscle, reduces hypertonicity of cardiac muscle, so it helps to modulate. This is why alpha-GPC is one of my most favorite supplements for those who have high blood pressure or arrhythmia, and really helps to get things back into an optimal rhythm without necessarily the need of allopathy. Or it can be utilized alongside allopathic remedies for the most part, apart from one or two medications. Increases proprioception of the peripheral nervous system, increases cortical processing, okay? So this is where it helps with the mesencephalon reticular formation in the midbrain. Improves attention capacity, so it's really important for those who have ADD or ADHD. Normally the outcome of ADD or ADHD is an excess of dopamine, not necessarily a sufficient quantity of acetylcholine. So for those that do have these learning disabilities, alpha-GPC or CDP choline would be a great, but alpha-GPC is more readily available to bypass the blood-brain barrier as a tool to aid more of a calm rhythm to learning and processing. Gamma-aminobutyric acid plays an excitatory role in the development of the brain. It is responsible for the regulation of muscle tone. So that excitatory role is only during the development of the brain, actually plays more of an inhibitory role later once the brain is fully developed. It regulates the formation of synapses in its excitatory role in neural crests, stimulates embryonic and neural stem cells, is synthesized from glutamate, okay, and regulates D2 receptor modulation. So gamma-aminobutyric acid is very important for that last point there. As I mentioned to you before, the difference between D1 and D2 is the activity of brakes or the acceleration. So GABA helps to modulate how well the body is able to accelerate dopamine activity. However, heightened dopamine actually reduces the activity of gamma-aminobutyric acid, so the brakes really need to be put into place. And this is where serotonin comes in and increases sensitivity of dopamine D1 receptors. So the balance between serotonin and GABA plays a huge role as to how well dopamine is able to modulate all neurotransmitters in states of excitation or inhibition. 90% of it is created in the lower intestine. Okay, so those that are struggling with large intestinal hydration are going to have negative impacts to the activity and formation of serotonin. It has an increased calming effect on the mind and regulates leptin sensitivity, regulates the mood and anxiety, has an impact on insulin sensitivity. Okay, just over here on dopamine. So again, excessive amounts of dopamine can really create apoptosis of brain cells over a long period of time. This reason why I wanted to bring you guys, make you guys aware of this slide is due to the metabolic intermediaries that it depletes when it is releasing excess. Glutathione is one of the biggest ones that it depletes over here. NAD is yet another. And you also find SOD, so it increases the release of oxygen superoxide free radicals. So superoxide dismutase is heavily utilized as well in this process. If you are unfortunately in a position where you're highly stressed and you cannot get away from it, whether it be your job that you're in, going through personal distressors, then what I would highly recommend is to look into a nootropic called Active Vegan. It was produced in the late 50s, and it contains probably the most dense amount of SOD in any form of nutraceutical that I've ever seen. In addition to that, obviously glutathione and NAD supplementation or intravenous therapy, which is more beneficial or better utilized, is also another suggestion that can help you to avoid neurodegeneration due to excessive dopamine release and toxicity. Okay, so just again, nervous system regulation of gastric function. So gamma-aminobutyric butyric acid also has an impact on the motility rate of the gut. Norepinephrine, glucocorticoids, somatostatin, ghrelin, and gastrin. Okay, also have an impact on gastrin as well, and the release of hydrochloric acid. Acetylcholine also has an impact on gastrin's release and the release positive release of motilin. And subsequently, acetylcholine also has an impact on another hormone, which is called PYY336, which inhibits excessive gastrin release, not overall, but inhibits the excessive release of gastrin, which is really helpful if you are in a state of poor large intestinal hydration or osmotic balance in the gut. Neurotensin increases the release of motilin, which is over a certain particular pH. It reduces the release of gastrin, and it regulates basically the different pH variables between the upper and lower gastrointestinal tract. Neuropeptide Y also increases the release of motilin. It also increases leptin sensitivity and neuropeptide Y reaction. Both neurotensin and neuropeptide Y determine the efficiency of transit time and subsequent PYY336. So PYY336 is very, very important in the utilization of electrolytes in the body, but also trace elements in the body. So this is a very important hormone that we can actually utilize as a peptide in specific cases where we suspect or consider that there's an issue of large or lower intestinal hydration. Electrolyte reabsorption, PYY36, it impacts the anion gap, okay, so the balance between chloride and bicarbonate. It also impacts the cations, sodium and potassium, which has an impact on the parathyroid reaction, excuse me, as well as calcium and phosphorus utilization. It helps to also regulate renal reaction to anion position. So in other words, has a positive subsequent follow-up impact onto the adrenals and their subsequent activity in the release of aldosterone. PYY336, also adrenal reaction to renal position, so restores the adrenal glands. Overall influence on autonomic tone and metabolic flexibility is huge with the utilization of PYY336. Very important, if you are going to use this peptide, no more than 200 micrograms a day is suggested. Just another caveat to this presentation. Any type of remedies or suggestions to remedies that are discussed here are for information purposes only. They're not to be used to treat, cure, or diagnose any disease. And if you decide to incorporate any of the protocols discussed here, it is at your own discretion and liability as well. Overall influence on autonomic tone and metabolic flexibility. Serotonin also helps to regulate motilin, which also has an impact on the microbiome. So very important, when there's an excessive release of motilin, what you'll find is the healthy microbiome actually gets flushed out the system, and the unwanted microbiome have a better opportunity to flourish. This is the reason why also fasting dietary plans are better to help, or useful, not better, are useful to aid in dysbiotic status, because they starve unwanted bacteria due to the fact that they have shorter half-life cycles. PYY336 also plays a huge role in regulating the subsequent rate of motilin release and subsequently aiding the starvation of unwanted bacteria from proliferation. Nitric oxide and substance P aids in the vasodilation of the intestinal tract, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but can also be detrimental. Obviously, nitric oxide is very important for the cardiovascular system, and vasodilation of components within the gastrointestinal tract are necessary for nutrient assimilation. However, in specific circumstances such as intestinal hyperpermeability, as noted with high zonulin counts, we really need to consider the quantity and the intake of substances such as arginine, as well as foods such as beetroot. In these specific circumstances, when there is a high zonulin count and intestinal permeability is a factor, these particular inclusions into one's lifestyle and diet can be detrimental toward increase of histamine responses. Vasoactive intestinal peptide increases nutrient absorption within the GIPH. Ghrelin, secretin, gamma-aminotransferase. So just going over here one more time. Okay, so ghrelin reduces motility rate, secretin increases motility rate, and once again, the balance between stress and calm is vital to be considered in gastrointestinal health and the impact it has on your fat loss and hypertrophy. Hormones that regulate the gastroendocrine system. Gastrin initiates the release of HCl to the parietal cells. It also subsequently has an impact in the release of pepsinogen from chief cells. Secretin from pancreas increases the release of bicarbonate when there's a certain amount of acidity in the chyme that enters through the pyloric sphincter. Stimulates gastrointestinal and gastrin inhibitory polypeptide, which helps to reduce the release of gastrin in the upper GI tract, preventing the mucosal cells from being damaged or ulceritis from occurring. Stimulates motilin, promotes muscle contraction or smooth muscle within the GI tract. Cholecystokinin, always enunciate that incorrectly, CCK, influence on the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so circadian rhythm plays a huge role in this. And this is another reason as to why poor sleep has a huge impact on bile activity. So when one isn't getting qualitative deep wave sleep, there is generally a poor utilization of bile due to poor contraction cycles in the gallbladder. Bile release. It's a major ghrelin and leptin player, okay, as it has a role on the circadian rhythm and the autonomic positioning through the circadian rhythm. PYY336 promotes water and electrolyte absorption in the colon, works in concert with somatostatin, which slows down the motility rate so the body has opportunity to absorb nutrients. Ghrelin promotes hunger and appetite, works in concert with gastrin, okay, if levels are not excessive. So initially, with this previous point, when we initially get hungry, we'll actually release gastrin, which will facilitate the initial release of stomach acid. This is the reason as to why when we are hungry and we do not feed ourselves, we can actually create colitis later down the line, which is basically inflammation along the colon or upper gastrointestinal components. So it's very, very important that when you are hungry, to firstly consider what it is that you're craving, because often if you're hungry for sugars and junk food, it's because of stress, and other methods can be employed in order to modulate that appetite, such as thyme tea or holy basil tea, or a whole bunch of other herbs that can help with that too. Or is it that you're hungry for a piece of steak, as an example? If it's the latter, that you're actually hungry for wholesome food, make sure to eat, because when you don't, it actually does cause havoc into the regulation of mucosal cell health in the stomach, which can lead to ulcer formation. Motilin has an impact on somatostatin and ghrelin. Gastrin initiates lower pH. Secretin facilitates higher pH variable releases. Opioids. Okay, very interesting. Like everyone's like, why are we talking about opioids in a gastrointestinal endocrine seminar here? Well, the three major innate opioids: endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins. Most of you would know about endorphins released from exercise, but the enkephalins play a huge role within our gastrointestinal system. That's the reason why I brought them up as a main point, a topic to discuss. Dynorphins play a huge role in thrombotic factors throughout the system as well. So that helps to prevent thrombosis, in essence. Enkephalins, however, particularly meta-5 enkephalin, has a huge role in regulating the immune system, particularly the activity of monocytes. And this can play a huge role in preventing foam cell aggregation, which causes huge amounts of inflammation along the gastrointestinal tract. Not only when you regulate monocyte activity, do you also regulate histamine response. It also modulates major histopathology complex 1, histamine complex 2. And this is basically the regulation within the innate immunity. Okay, it's like the antigen presenting components of our antibodies. It helps to modulate the sensitivity and the recognition of these particular parts of our antigen presenting cells. Facilitates interleukin-10 activity, which reduces obstructive breathing response. Okay, it also helps to relax the relax the bronchioles, induce better respiration, and improve not just vasodilation, but also breathing rhythm. Aids in the regeneration of endothelial and nerve cells. Okay, balances gamma-beta-butyric activity throughout the nervous system. So this plays a huge role in dopamine, as mentioned before, and actually preventing the excitotoxicity that dopamine can have throughout the nervous system. And very interestingly as well, it also reduces oncogenesis, the likelihood and the proliferation of cancer cell growth. This is the reason as to why with particular autoimmune cases or severe histamine responses or severe states of depression, that we are likely to advise our clientele of the use of low-dose naltrexone, which is quite a novel repurposing of a drug that was once initially used for heroin addicts. But actually the low dose actually has a completely different reactive outcome to the state of one's physiology. Detoxification pathways. So we have phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 1 is modification, where we basically alter the activity of chemicals throughout the body through the P450 enzyme reaction predominantly. Through oxidation, we lose electrons and things become a lot more unstable or more reactive. Through reduction, there's a gain of electrons and they become more stable and less reactive to the body. Hydrolysis, basically when we take something that's more in a lipid state and we make it more water or hydrophilic, and for the purpose of conjugation to take better effect in eliminating toxins from the body. It's determined by the polarity of metabolites. Okay, so whether either of these three will take place in the reaction of modification. Okay, detoxification phase 2, 6 major conjugation pathways. Methyltransferase, okay, helps with estrogen detoxification. It's needed, so choline, 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, methylcobalamin are necessary precursors. Sulfation helps in getting rid of bowel toxins such as indole, phenol. Taurine, glycine, and methionine are important for this particular pathway. There are also, just to have a little caveat here, these are just mainly the amino acids that are necessary, but there are also minerals, other micronutrient components that aren't mentioned here that are vitally important for these pathways to take place, such as insulfation, copper, insulation of copper is very, very important. Acetyltransferase helps to detoxify, to metabolize red blood cells, aids in the reformation of gastric mucosa, and also helps to regulate lymphocyte activity. Homocysteine levels, if they're very high, can actually have an impact on acetyltransferase levels. So make sure to modulate homocysteine levels to bring down or to increase activity of acetyltransferase to ensure better red blood cell health, mucosal health, and lymphocyte reactivity. Glucuronal transferase over here. Okay, so this helps with bilirubin, steroid hormone. This is like glucuronidation. This will help the elimination of foreign particles from the body or xenobiotics from the body. Glutathione is probably the most active. 60% of conjugation actually occurs with glutathione pathway. Bile is very important for your production of bile, glutathione. Excessive exercise, pollution, alcohol intake can actually deplete glutathione. Amino acid conjugation and glycine use basically is very, very important for uric acid metabolism. So to be able to metabolize pyrimidine and purine metabolism. It's very important for catecholamine metabolism. So catecholamines do not reach in excess. It aids in insulin sensitivity, and the influencing factors to amino acid conjugation are glycine, taurine, glutamine, arginine, and ornithine. Again, guys, just looking at arginine and ornithine and even glutamine, don't go out now and buy all these amino acids and start utilizing them thinking that you're going to modulate your stress response. You need to look into the state and the health of your intestinal permeability, because often if your permeability is poor, then we can have a heightened histamine reaction from the intake of these specific amino acids, causing an unwanted reaction to the liver, creating more compounded toxicity in the body. So everything needs to be used in consideration of the actual state of the person that we are dealing with. Okay, bowel metabolism, phase 3 detox. Okay, the liver produces filters 1.82 liters every minute. 300 enzymes are released into the gastrointestinal tract. Bile, it produces 600 to 1200 milliliters a day. Metabolism of red blood cells. Okay, so heme and globulin fractures are separated from one another. Bilirubin is produced from the heme. Polypeptides are produced from the globulin fractions. Bilirubin goes through a process of transferrin, transfer bilirubin to, that's unconjugated bilirubin, so transferrin helps to bring it to the liver. The liver conjugates bilirubin. Bile is released into the hepatic duct. Microbiome relation, okay. It basically excretes conjugated toxins. It possibly inhibits bile-bound toxin removal. Dysbiosis, so we have an unwanted quantity of bacteria occurring in the gut, in the bowels. It can actually strip the bile of its conjugated toxin and create intrahepatic recirculation of toxins, and that bile can actually be fed upon by the dysbiotic bacteria. So it's very important to look into whether it's either an organic acids test or a GI map or a GI 360 test to see exactly what the quantity of dysbiotic flora you currently have and what is the best route of action to take, whether allopathic or naturopathic, as well as probiotic or sporebiotic compounds to use prior to increasing activity of specific bile factors. Very important to note with that as well, increasing the quantity of bile production or taking in bile acids where you have poor bacterial balance can actually feed that bacteria. Okay? So you can actually cause more of a problem with dysbiosis if you don't get rid of the most immediate issue, which is that of impaired bacterial balance. Okay, so this is basically where bile is, or the metabolism of bile goes to. So it becomes stercobuline, and it's released in the fecal matter. So 80% of bile is released in fecal matter, 2% is released in the urine matter. Okay, and basically an intrahepatic component of bile is 18%. Right, so blood markers to look out for with regards to how well your body is able to get rid of toxins, which is one of the major stress factors we were talking about before that contribute toward the hypothalamus pituitary axis. AST, aspartic acid transferase, urea, oxidation, and iron gap, glucose turnover, blood glucose regulation. These are all the factors that AST has an impact over. Indirect hepatic influence from the periphery. ALT impacts non-alcoholic fatty liver disease will increase ALT. Direct hepatic influence. Okay, so if you have high ALT, it's something directly wrong with the liver. Gamma transferase, recycling glutathione. Okay. Global toxicity levels, so if your levels are really high, you have a high toxic burden from heavy metals or from other types of xenobiotics. Biotransforms inflammatory cytokines. So if you are having cytokine storms due to autoimmune reactivity, this will also be a good marker to look into. Alcoholism, obesity, biliary obstruction, or stasis, or liver disease are all factors that can impair GGT. Very important, ALT to AST ratio over 0.82 increases the risk of diabetes. So it's not just the individual ratio number, but it's the ratio that both of these markers share between one another. AST to ALT ratio above 102 increases the risk of a heart attack or heart disease. Phase 3 blood markers, ALP, alkaline phosphatase. Biliary obstruction can really impair this. Leaky gut, poor zinc status, poor hydrochloric acid regulation, poor testosterone levels. So often what we find in our liver panels is most people will not necessarily have poor AST or ALT levels, apart from maybe athletes that are on a high level of performance, or those who are following hedonistic lifestyles, but we often see poor levels of ALT. And this is, again, linked to dysbiosis, linked to gastrointestinal compromise, which can have a real negative impact on the androgen levels, which are necessary for maintaining an optimal state of body composition. Lactate dehydrogenase, excessive inflammation, high toxin turnover, so it might be from the environment or the diet or the lifestyle. Now, just talk about a little extra bonus round here. So before I go into this segment, the last segment of the seminar, thank you guys for just listening to us far. But before I continue into the peptide section, does anybody have any questions? If you do, please go ahead and ask them now. Okay, cool. All right. Guess everybody is happy. All right, so just getting into peptides. Okay, so peptides are my favorite little, hello?
Hey, Justin, just Dr. Dom here. I wanted to apologize.
How are you?
That I didn't connect it to you calling me out earlier because I had to bring my son to the bus. That's it. Otherwise, I'm in the seminar and loving it. And
no problem.
And the bile section was just amazing, man. Really, really good. But I don't want to distract you here because now the peptide section is really, really fascinating to me. So continue.
You must. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Dom. It's absolute pleasure.
It's quite early here in Germany. Yeah, thank you for having me.
I know it's very early in the rest of the world. We definitely have recorded the video, so we'll post it up on social media for everybody to watch at a later time as well. But thank you for taking the time out of your day so early to join us for this conversation.
Thank you for the talk. It's amazing.
You're most welcome. Most welcome, sir. Thank you. Okay, so going back into a little extra bonus round here. I'm a big advocate for the utilization of peptide hormones. And the reason for it is that they have a very short activity in the body. Unlike cholesterol-bound hormones that have a very prolonged activity, they're easier to control the reactivity that they have within one's physiology. So one can do a lot of good by the utilization of specific peptide hormones to restore integrity of an imbalanced state of physiology. So we're going to go into some basic ones. There obviously are hundreds, if not thousands of more, definitely hundreds more that we utilize for autonomic coaching. Let's get straight into that. So the first peptide over here, ipamorelin, suppresses somatostatin. Okay, so this helps in cases where one might have extreme constipation, may have extreme bloating, bowel toxemia. Ipamorelin is a really good peptide to help with and to remove the likelihood of an increase of bowel toxemia due to poor transit time in the gut. It doesn't raise cortisol, aldosterone, or prolactin levels. Therefore, it does not have a dramatic negative impact on the adrenals, unlike normal 191 sequence growth hormone, which does. Okay, so regular growth hormone does increase cortisol, does increase aldosterone and prolactin levels. Hence the reason as to why regular human growth hormone can have a negative impact on the status of adrenal health over time if used incorrectly. If used correctly, it can obviously be restorative. At very large dosages or doses was reported to give a large release of growth hormone without desensitization. Okay, and we're talking extreme dosages here, well beyond what's been advocated. It doesn't promote hunger. It doesn't have ghrelins and lipogenic properties. Okay. There's a 2-hour half-life. Okay, increases the density of calcium utilization, improves GI recovery after bowel resection, and is a treatment of post-operative ileus. Okay, so it's really helpful to restore anybody's gastrointestinal integrity after any form of surgery that has been occurred, with, like, for example, ulcers or any growths and such. BPC 157 body protection compounds, also called Deca, Penta, something or another. BPC 157, we'll call it body protection compound, produced in the gastromucosa. It is used for a whole multitude of functions, as you can see over here, for everything from an anti-ulcer peptide agent, which is the reason why I really brought into this seminar. So it really is helpful to aid in the effects that H. pylori, if present in the body, may have on inducing ulceritis. So it also helps with the impact that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs may have on the gastromucosa. It improves the reformation of collagenous network in the gastric mucosa. It's neuroprotective in that it also obviously helps the histamine reactions. It helps nerve regeneration, helps with depression. It helps gastric protection, as mentioned before. Dosages are over here, and there's obviously for informative purposes. If you do decide to go ahead and utilize this, it's at your own discretion. Counteracts, this is very important, of course, so any type of antipsychotics or antidepressants anybody might be using, it helps to reduce the negative impact that it might have on the brain. Okay. Excuse me. So tesamorelin, also known as Egrifta, applications in helps lipid metabolism, okay, and controls inflammation. This is really important for those who have poor cholesterol profiles and also poor sleep in conjunction with cholesterol profiles. So poor sleep and poor cholesterol profiles actually have an associated correlation to the increase of foam cell aggregation, which is extremely inflammatory to the bowels. So tesamorelin works really well in these particular cases. It also improves those who are struggling with edema, poor vascular flow, especially to the periphery. So any tall people that are generally have issues with blood flow to their ankles and wrists, what have you, this works really well to aid in that. It's generally used for people with a higher BMI, increased central obesity around or visceral fat, higher triglyceride levels, decrease HDL levels. It works really well for that. Increased hypertension. So this is a better one than ipamorelin to use if there is any incidence of hypertension. If there is increase of CRP, C-reactive protein, it works really well to modulate that. It also helps with any imbalances that goes on within the cardiac ventricles as well, just to improve the sinus rhythm in the heart too. Thymosin alpha-1, probably my favorite peptide of them all. This is a really interesting peptide in that it helps to basically, it's a pleiotropic peptide. It basically helps to differentiate the different white blood cells and the production of different white blood cells as and when needed. It's a thymic peptide, obviously produced from the thymus gland, which often can become inefficient in situations of hormone replacement therapy over periods of time. So it's a really important peptide to consider for those that are taking prolonged use of hormone replacements or hormones as such. In particular for women that are actually on contraceptive pills, actually a very important one to incorporate in that use. It's influenced by a multitude of physiological and pathological conditions, which means that it's also very important for neuroprotection and emotional valence. Going down here, promotes T cell differentiation, balance out Th1 responses, okay, which is basically innate responses, innate immune responses, histamine responses. It also balances out innate versus adaptive histamine responses. So from a viral to bacterial histamine responses, it helps to modulate them so they're not proliferate in excess, dampening the overall immunity over time. This also activates this particular compound, indolamine, 2.3 dioxygenase, okay, which is very important to help regulate the rate of immunity itself. So for those who have autoimmune imbalances, this is an amazing peptide to utilize as an adjunct to any other form of allopathy that you might be currently prescribed. Enhances dendritic cells, okay, so it helps, in other words, the communication of synapses between neural bodies, enhances antibody responses, blocks steroid-induced apoptosis of thymocytes, which is what I mentioned before about the AHRT. It's used in chronic illness, depression, metabolic syndrome, weight management issues, insulin resistance type 2, increases oxidative stress. The increase of oxidative stress associated with aging, so it's anti-aging, helps with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, illnesses that it treats: cancer, environmental toxins, chronic infections, Lyme disease, candida, parasites. Helps with glutathione depletion, particularly in situations where dopamine toxicity is present. It helps to result in TH1 to TH2 shift with a viral insult. It helps with dysbiosis, getting rid of unwanted bacteria by regulating TH1 responses. It helps with food allergies and sensitivities, zinc and selenium deficiencies. Other autoimmune, this is all there. Dosages. Over here, I would prefer, personally, I prefer to utilize this dosage protocol here, whereas we utilize 1.5 milligrams sub-Q every third day. Okay. Has been approved by the Orphan Drug Program by the FDA, by the way. Thymosin beta-4, very interesting peptide as well. Helps to balance out mast cells and macrophages as well. It also helps to produce more white blood cells. Okay, so for those that are having issues with platelet volume, it also helps to balance out the quantity of platelet aggregation, but also improving the quantity and density of leukocytes available to the system. Over here, it's an anti-inflammatory, promotes wound healing, enhances collagen deposition as well. So it helps there again with the disulfide bridging of amino acids. It works against sarcopenia, okay, which is extremely important. Helps angiogenesis and the differentiation of endothelial cells. It's a potent anti-inflammatory for wounds, muscles, and joints. Reduces chronic pain, prevents adhesions and fibrous band formation in injured tissues, muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Promotes and restores neurons with post-traumatic brain injury. Promotes hair growth. Used as an anti-inflammatory, collagen production. It's cytoprotective to the cell, okay? So especially if anybody's going through chemotherapy, it can actually help. Reduces the level of myofibril and supports immunity. So it's antiviral, antimicrobial. Improves T-cell reactivity. You can use it with thymosin alpha-1 for neuroprotection as well. These are the dosage parameters that one can consider. And that is the end of today's slideshow seminar. Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope to hear any questions and feedbacks to those of you that weren't able to join the seminar. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@autonomiccoaching.com. We will also be putting up a link for you guys to download a free book, which indicates if you're having particular symptoms towards specific systems in your body, what naturopathic remedies you can think about incorporating in order to deal with those symptoms itself. In addition to that, guys, if you have any questions to ask, please do feel free just to drop us a message on Instagram as well. And we will also be posting up our app for you guys to be able to give a run and a try, in which we are able to ascertain which are the predominant physiological systems in your body that are in need of up or down regulation in their activity. In other words, optimizing your ability to become more superhuman. From me, Justin McGuire, thank you once again for tuning in to Autonomic Coaching's seminar on gastrointestinal hormone impact on fat loss and hypertrophy. Take care, keep well, and stay healthy. Bye now.